have to plan dates in advance to do this work annually. You have to plan in advance to review semi-annually. And engaging an outside party to help is really important. And there's a number of ways to do it. Now is the time that you want expertise and specialization. Inflation is here. It's going to get worse. Putting together these cost savings pipelines, these cost saving strategies are now more important than ever. There are certainly growth initiatives, revenue initiatives. However, in my opinion, I think as we go into 2022 and 2023, cost focus, expense focus has to be a number one priority. There are just so many opportunities there. It cannot be done haphazardly. We've got to do this around budget season. This has to be its own specialization.
Welcome to the Healthcare Leadership Experience, a place where healthcare leaders will share proven strategies and innovative approaches to leading the clinical and business side of healthcare. This show is sponsored by VIE Healthcare Consulting, who has proudly helped hospitals save over $700 million in non-labor costs since 1999. Here's your host, Lisa Miller, founder and CEO of VIE Healthcare.
Welcome to the Healthcare Leadership Experience. Today's episode is planning your 2022 cost savings pipeline of opportunities. And as normal, we have Lisa Larter sitting in with me today, our show producer. So we're going to have a great discussion on planning your 2022 cost savings pipeline opportunities. We also have two special guests. We have Rich Dormer and Bryan Covert from VIE. So welcome, Rich and Bryan.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
And good morning, Lisa. How are you?
I am great. Lisa, how are you?
I'm good. I'm looking forward to having this really interesting discussion today because it's a subject that comes up often this time of season for us and our clients, and also for new prospective clients as well.
I love it. I've never heard anybody talk about creating or planning a cost savings pipeline. It's a really, really smart idea. Like visually, it makes me think about, long-term cost savings strategy, which is so important.
So it's interesting because, that's I think the terminology, and I think that's the budgetary approach to what hospitals are looking to do. They need a pipeline of cost savings opportunities. And so, they've got to plan their budget. They have to plan for their goals. Everything rolls up into the organizational goals. And so, the idea of having a pipeline is similar to having a real cost saving strategy. We do a lot of work around having a cost savings pipeline working session where we spend about 2 or 3 hours on 2 different days with our clients and rolling up our sleeves and really digging into the specificity of making this plan, this cost strategy. But we get a lot of these calls about, can you help us with our pipeline? We need next year's pipeline. And so I think it's an entry point. I think it's a moment in time where they're kind of taking a look at what those opportunities may be. I think the challenge is that sometimes it may be too broad. It may be doesn't have enough specificity. It's putting some numbers on a target, and I think that's great. But I think where we come in, and I know Bryan and Rich are going to talk about it, is adding more precision, adding more specific nuance to it. Make sure you're capturing some of your larger spend, problem area spend. There's high spend, middle spend, low spend. There's ways to address different aspects, physician preference items, utilization. And so my fear in, putting together some of these cost savings pipelines is that there's not enough of a specific roadmap that you capture all these different opportunities or areas or nuances. So, Bryan, what are your thoughts about your experience about putting together a cost savings pipeline?
I think that's a great point, and especially you're just talking about physician preference items. So when you're developing that roadmap, are you just looking at it from a benchmarking point of view? We could take 10% out of our CRM products, or are you looking at in terms of a standardization and a much larger initiative? We're going to right size the pricing for like implants across all vendors and eliminate those who don't conform. So there's a big difference between putting 10% on the board and doing an organizational wide standardization products with physician support.
Yeah, I agree. And you know what? Something came up last week that I love that you were working on, and it's true about standardization, it's true about pricing, but you find gaps. You find some interesting gaps of new items or items that are maybe limited use, and all of these variation or limited use items that are, you know, not always captured are big opportunities. And I think, again, that's my fear in having a pipeline versus a strategy. And I think the pipeline's important, but having a working session where, as you pointed out, we're going really deeper, you know, that 10% maybe 20%. And I think sometimes if we kind of put a 10 or 15% target and you get there, do you miss out on the 22% target that could have been there?
I think that's absolutely right. And then are you just settling for what everybody's already accomplished? Are you pushing to something new and better? And then are you just looking at the same initiatives every 4 years? Are you looking at the ones everybody's aware of, spine, total joint, CRM? Or are you really going through all of your implant spend, every case, and saying, no, I know this is a specialty vendor and there's nobody else in the market, but does this price make sense? And is anybody else getting a better price?
Yeah, it's a great point. You know, achieving to the norms that means you're just going to get the norm. And, you know, we often like to push our clients and get them exceeding norms. And we're able to do that with their help. You know, it's a collaborative effort. But, you know, Rich, do you have some thoughts about?
And Bryan mentioned, you know, this is from the physician preference items, but it's the same with the purchase services with that cycle. What we're seeing is that, you know, the traditional vendors, food nutrition, EVS, lithotripsy, hemodialysis, these are the ones that are always focused on. They're the bigger spend. They're the ones that have been traditionally looked at from a purchase service world. They should be looked at every cycle. They should be looked at, you know, during their term as well. But those gaps also exist, and they're bigger in purchase services. There's a lot more spend that is not visible to most times supply chain and finance to be able to run reports, to be able to really dive into and find those opportunities. So when you look at the rev cycle side, you look at support services, you look at administration, IT, HR. These are a lot of these areas that have been traditionally negotiated and managed in silos and not through supply chain and through finance. That is where the opportunities that we're seeing, and those are where the focus that we bring to the table when we do these strategic pipelines, is to capture all these different areas, different gaps within our organization, and then put those in the spotlight to be able to negotiate best pricing, best services, remove duplications, and really just get the best deal in place for the organization.
Yeah, it's a great point, because a lot of these pipelines are always, they're looking at the same things, and there's still opportunities every year to look at physician preference items, to look at new items. They need focus, but there's so much spend, as Rich mentioned, in purchase services that doesn't get looked at annually, that doesn't get a real precise review or analysis because it may be sensitive. May take a little longer. It may take getting data from your invoice data for purchase services. So that's going to, maybe hold things up a little bit. But, I think there's 3 parts to a cost savings pipeline. It's getting the data organized, right? So that starts with an AP spend. It starts with PO details. It starts with agreements, looking at your new agreements, looking at midterm agreements, looking at those that are coming due. You can't just build a pipeline on agreements that are coming due in the next year. It has to be part of looking at those midterm agreements. Could be some great opportunities as well as some of those larger agreements. The second part is this high level target opportunity approach is great, but you've got to get some specificity around these areas as well. And then third, there are urgent issues, right? There are things that will come up that are coming up, and you've got to prioritize those. Those could be service issues. Those could be just a spike in costs. Those could be, as we just experienced new costs as it relates to COVID testing. And we were one of the first companies in the nation to help hospitals benchmark and get a lower, very competitive COVID test, whether it was outsourced or insourced. So there's always looking at ways, even new areas to spend, urgent areas, and still addressing it. Just because it's new doesn't mean it can't be benchmarked, it can't be modeled, it can't be negotiated. And that's really critical.
And as far as when your plan is put together, and again, when you look at a year, so you're looking at a year, and sometimes it's more a 2 or 3 year plan as well. But Most of the time, we're working with our clients to work on the next year, what the pipeline is going to look like. So how is that going to be implemented? When is it going to start? 3 months, 6 months to be successful within the year? And, Lisa touched upon it, but, prior to this, when we start to put all that data together, it's important to really understand, project by project, initiative by initiative, who the stakeholders. So if are we pulling in physicians and nurses, we looking at the finance team, support services, HR, in some cases, IT is involved in certain initiatives, and maybe they're doing something like we had a client recently that's implementing their new EMR system. So we had to make sure that we're planning based on their priorities, their resources. In addition to the data, pulling that together, what vendors, what categories, but also reimbursement. So not only on the physician preference items, but also on some of these clinical purchase services, we're going to want to know how that reimbursement ties in. So that all has to be planned. Those things are not going to be turned around in a week. But if you put a plan together and you understand how long it's going to take and the analysis behind it, that will help build that successful plan. Because at the end of the day, it's how quickly you can go. Some initiatives, you might not look at it and say, oh, it's only about a $10,000 to $15,000 opportunity, but you can get it done in 30 days. Other ones that, could be $350,000, $500,000 opportunity might take 4 to 6 months, depending on the stakeholders, again, with the bandwidth and whatnot. So it's important to get all those dynamics together and then establish your plan and work with the team on the expectations, what it would look like.
Yeah, it's a great point, Rich. And the other area to this, but which you've touched upon in what you were talking about, is project management. And so a lot of times with these, the pipelines needs to come with a hierarchy, of what's important, what can be done easily, who can do it, but really a strong project plan. And in a future episode, you'll hear we'll talk about a high performing project management system. And it's really important that you have one in place. It's not emails or it's not meetings. It's not Excel. It's a real system that does what you need it to do in terms of managing these initiatives that, has several levels of accountability. We use them here at VIE. So definitely, as you're building your cost savings pipeline, some of my recommendations, Bryan, I'd like to get your input on recommendations, but some of my recommendations are you're going to have to probably carve out 3 or 4 days out of the year. And that may be one full day or a couple of half days. But, when you prepare and you put that time into preparation, you will reap the rewards, right? Fortune favors those who prepare, who have momentum. Momentum is key. So we're big believers in kind of dedicating that time to, that disciplined thinking time, sitting down, going through areas of spend, looking at changes in spend. What are they? Looking at benchmarking, analyzing some of those agreements. We talk about strategic sourcing, but do we talk about strategic monitoring, measuring? Maybe now is a good time as you're building your pipeline to look at some of those opportunities to measure and monitor to see where you're at. And then that may be also what funnels in some opportunities because you're not as far as long as you thought you were going to be at, in that contract or in that cost savings. So, it's also what new things do you need to consider? And then Rich and Bryan both spoke about that. Bryan, do you have anything else? Any other recommendations?
That's really comprehensive. And I like where you really talked about the contract planning and the project plan, because there's just so many important details that need to be tracked. If you don't know contractually when you need to notify to get out of a contract to renegotiate, you could have a great initiative with a great cost savings opportunity, but just no opportunity to actually engage in it because you just re-upped for 5 years without knowing.
Yeah, and I kind of want to talk to you about that because we may have people listening today that go, oh, that's just a junior thing to mention, renewals. That's completely junior. We have that. We have a no auto renew in all our agreements, or we get notified through our contract management system, or we're on top of that. That's completely basic. I can't believe you're talking about that today. And then we see day in and day out, extremely smart people, sophisticated systems, processes, health systems having auto renews in their contracts. And when there could be great opportunities for cost savings, they've just auto renewed, or there's a clause that auto renewed at an increase. And I actually think that, if I were going into a brand new hospital and, as a CFO, I'd want to know all my contracts and when they ought to renew.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what you're talking about, we've seen. I've worked with clients on initiatives where we thought there was going to be a great opportunity. And the client said, yeah, no, we sent out our notification term. We sent it out 6 months ago, but actually went to the wrong address. It didn't go to the address in the contract where they had to send it. Vendor never received it. Contract renewed for 5 years. Nothing you could do. We've seen everything in terms of contracts renewing. And I get what you're saying and all of those parameters, and it's junior, but that's honestly one of the first things I go to on any initiative. When's this contract renew? Did we do what we need to do to keep it from renewing? Are we able to go in with some leverage? Because you just lose that negotiation leverage with your
Right.
renewal.
No, you do. I mean, certainly, we've done a lot of work with midterm contracts, and there's ways to gain leverage. There's ways to, kind of still take out costs, but it really does become a bit more challenging. But I think that's an important aspect to the cost savings pipeline is when are these contracts renewing? It's a good point, Bryan. Any other good points as we wrap this up?
We'll go into it more on the project management side, but, again, establishing with this cost reduction plan for 2022 or future, it's important with understanding the stakeholders, the bandwidth, and how those individuals will be part of the process. And the biggest piece is the executive leadership to be able to support these initiatives because, Mike Tyson famously said, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face. This is one of those where when it gets challenging, it gets tough negotiation. If you don't have the executive leadership supporting these initiatives that they can weigh on, they can come in on, then they're not going to be successful.
Yeah, and you make a really good point about Mike Tyson's comment, because I think we all got kind of, been in that circumstance now with COVID and the pandemic. And the first things that went aside, appropriately so, were a lot of these initiatives. So, I think lessons learned as we move forward and we're still moving through the pandemic, your prioritization of these cost savings products, there still needs to be someone who's also running point on that, because those costs are still being accumulated and they still need to be looked at. And I think there's a couple of things that, to keep in mind. You have to plan dates in advance to do this work annually. You have to plan in advance to review semi-annually. And engaging an outside party to help is really important. And there's a number of ways to do it. Whether that's a company like VIE that can come in and support, help you with a working session, help you identify opportunities, help you achieve those. We think that's, really important because we're able to keep and push and help support your hospital while there's so many different competing priorities. We're able to continue to advance the initiatives. There's other ways too that, let's say you've got a specific initiative and you need just a little more resource or people power. You might want to engage somebody in your local college to help with a specific project, or just get some kind of per diem help to help with a specific project. But it's really important that there's some time and thought, there's some expertise. Now is the time that you want expertise and specialization. Inflation is here. It's going to get worse. Putting together these cost savings pipelines, these cost saving strategies are now more important than ever as a way to protect and even further reduce costs. But I'm writing a short book now on inflation in healthcare, and it is so important as we move into 2022 that you've got a plan. And this plan has to be an assertive, aggressive plan to really help take out costs, because the vendors are going to come in now and you are going to see price increases. So partnering with somebody who has specialization, expertise that can really support getting a big part of your initiatives to be successful quickly is important. So Lisa, what do you think about all this? Now you've heard Bryan and Rich and I talk about this. What are your closing thoughts about building a pipeline for cost savings opportunities?
Well, It sounds really complicated to me for someone who doesn't work in healthcare. It sounds like there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of things that really need to be considered, and that you really need to kind of zoom back and look at the big picture and figure out what areas you need to get really granular and specific at. And, in my experience working with business owners, not hospitals, I have found that it's really hard to do that by yourself. So I can see why hospitals bring you and your team in to do this work with them, because it really does feel like it's a big initiative to take on and requires a lot of discipline to revisit on a regular basis to ensure that what you are projecting in your cost savings pipeline actually comes to fruition.
Yeah, that's a great point. How do you measure the pipeline to what really has happened? How do does your organization do look back work? Look back work is important just to see what do we do, versus what we said we're going to do. You don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but look back work is important.
Right. And if you look at the small business world, for example, you look back at your sales and you look at your trends, and then you project what you can expect to see happen in the future. You can do the exact same thing with cost savings, but it requires discipline and dedication in order to be able to do that. So when I think about your cost savings pipeline, it's like people can actually forecast and then inspect what they are forecasting to save to ensure that they're getting the savings that they projected when they do this type of work. But if they don't do this type of planning work, it's impossible to do that.
Right. And leadership is depending on these cost savings pipelines now more than ever. There are certainly growth initiatives, revenue initiatives. However, in my opinion, I think as we go into 2022 and 2023, cost focus, expense focus has to be a number one priority. There are just so many opportunities there. It cannot be done haphazardly. We've got to do this around budget season. This has to be its own specialization. And because what Rich mentioned before, there are things that don't fall into the supply chain that are in individual departments, and people can be sensitive if they want to look into an agreement in their department. And there's lots of other sensitivities that happen. And all those sensitivities and silos have to be removed, because there is a great opportunity for a big takeout, a big, not only strategic sourcing, but strategic measuring and monitoring. And that's how hospitals are going to get to this greater level of cost savings. So I want to thank Rich and Bryan from the VIE team. And Lisa, thanks for sitting in with me today. And we're going to do this again next week and continue to do that, because we have some great conversations. So I encourage everybody to listen to our previous episode, Cost Aware for Patient Care. And our next show is episode 21, Why Engage a Healthcare Consulting Firm. I'd love to hear from you. What's a top strategy for your cost savings in 2022? And leave us some feedback. If you'd like to hear something on future episodes, let us know. So thank you for joining the Healthcare Leadership Experience.
Hi, this is Leah. You are listening to my mom's podcast, The Healthcare Leadership Experience.
Hi, this is Fernando. If you would like to speak with my mom, just email her.